wasn't supposed to be here today. I wasn't supposed to be standing here in front of all of you, and I definitely wasn't supposed to be in Baltimore. I'm actually supposed to be here, 8,000 miles away, in a low-income community, teaching in Mumbai, India. In the center of that bustling metropolis is a square mile of earth that's home to over 1 million people. That slum is known as Dharavi. And it's one of the largest slums in the world. Of the 1 million stories in Dharavi, I got to know just 34 of them. And those 34 stories belong to my 34 sixth grade students. There was Kabir, who would go home after school every day and make dinner for his younger siblings because there was no one else to do it for him. And there was Lavanya, who brought me to tears one day when she told me that she wanted to be a teacher just like me when she grew up. And there was Rahul, whose violence and aggression in the classroom became all the more understandable to me when I learned of the violence and abuse that was happening in his home every single night. I went to Dharavi to teach, but I also went there to learn those stories and help tell them. Stories like Kabir's and Lavanya's and Rahul's. Stories that go neglected and often unheard in a place such as Dharavi. I went so far away to help tell those stories, but the story that I found there was my own. I remember the morning of November 28th, 2013, more vividly than any other day of my life. Mumbai was just beginning to descend into winter, and the air was lighter, and the smog less dense. I left that morning to do what I did every morning. I would meet one of my co-teachers at a nearby rickshaw stand, and the two of us would hold onto that rickshaw as we ricocheted from one end of the street to another. And we would navigate the narrow alleyways of Dharavi and hop over the flooded sewers. All of this before 7 o'clock in the morning, when the rest of Mumbai was still sleeping. So that morning, I left at the same time I always did, as night was beginning to turn into dawn. And I crossed the Eastern Express Highway, which is always bustling with traffic on either side at all hours of the day. And I passed the same people I always did, the dog walkers and the joggers and the still sleeping taxi cab drivers who would sleep with their feet hanging outside of an open car door. And I walked up to the same roundabout called Science Circle. And I saw the same men that I always did. I saw the tea seller at his stand, and I saw the newspaper vendor on his bicycle, and the security guard of the jewelry store. But that morning, there was someone else there too. Someone I hadn't ever seen before. He was leaning against a tree, and he looked a little bit lost. I half expected him to ask me for directions. As I came closer to him, he seemed strange, and I took a step to the side to navigate around him, and he came in front of me. And I took a step to the other side, and he came even closer. At 5 feet away, I saw something silver dart from the corner of my eye. And at 4 feet away, I realized that that flash had been the blade of a knife. And at 3 feet away, I realized what was happening. I realized what was about to happen to me. I was about to be assaulted. What happened next, and the way I remember it, is a combination of things happening in hyperspeed and in slow motion. I remember that knife coming straight to my stomach, and I remember blocking it with my left hand. In fact, I remember that knife more vividly than his face, because all I kept thinking to myself was, that knife has to stay as far away from me as possible. Perhaps a bit surprised that I had had the audacity to fight back, he stabbed harder the second time, and this time it sliced my palm in half. I remember feeling something wet, but it would only be a few minutes later when I would realize that what was dripping down my wrists, down to my elbows, was my own blood. I remember pushing him back, struggling to maintain balance as I kicked him, even with my flimsy flip-flops. And I remember him grabbing my breast. And I remember screaming. I don't know what I screamed, and I don't know what my voice sounded like. But I know that I screamed because I could see every single person's face who passed me by. I remember each person slowing down, pausing and turning to watch this scene that was taking place in front of them. And I remember every single person pausing and every single person walking right by, not pausing to help, despite my many pleas. I remember the sound that my body made, the thud as my back hit the concrete. And I remember laying there, half on the sidewalk and half on the street, and seeing him tower above me, and thinking to myself that this was the very moment he could rape me if he wanted to. I blinked and it was over. He had gotten onto the back of a motorcycle. In fact, he was gone. There had been a man waiting there on that motorcycle, plotting and planning, knowing exactly what was going to happen, his getaway ride. And I stood up, not knowing what to do or where to go, and I just started to run. I didn't know where I was going to go, but I had to get out of that place. And again, I felt something wet and warm, but this time, it was on my face. I touched a bloody palm to my cheek, and I realized that I was crying. The physical ramifications of my assault were, relatively speaking, quite minimal. In addition to some bruises on my body and the cuts on my hand, I also had a fractured tailbone from the sheer force with which my attacker had thrown me to the ground. But the severe pain of that and the bed rest that I had to deal with, well, that was nothing. Nothing compared to the emotional and mental trauma that ensued. I felt completely alone. I didn't want to talk about what had happened. I didn't want to go back to that place. The very thought of opening that door and walking down the street, well, forget about doing it. The very idea of stepping outside made me paralyzed with fear. Even when I would walk down the street with a group of friends and pepper spray in my hand, I was completely debilitated. For months, I shuffled between police stations and hospitals. No one could seem to understand why this had happened to me. In fact, to this day, I still don't know who my attacker was and the motivations behind my assault. I felt completely lost. And one thing became very, very clear as that investigation lagged on and on. I was not safe. And so a few months after my assault, I left Mumbai. I came home and I cocooned myself into the shell of fear and anxiety. And I realized that those nightmares that I was having, where I would be stabbed again and again and no one would help me, and I would awake screaming, sweating, I realized that everything I was experiencing were actually symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And after seeking professional help, I would come home and I just felt lost. But really, it's that I was experiencing loss. On the day that I was assaulted, I lost a part of myself. And I don't just mean losing the ability to walk down the street without feeling that nothing is going to happen. I lost my classroom, and I lost my kids. I lost all self-confidence, and I honestly didn't know where to go from there. And I couldn't even finish doing that very thing that I had set out to do. I couldn't finish telling those stories. And to me, this loss could be summed up into a single word: failure. I was a failure. On all accounts, I had failed, and I was afraid that that was all I would ever be. After my assault, I didn't even know how to go back to the things I thought I was good at. I couldn't think about telling stories or writing. And I didn't know if I wanted to step into a classroom again, or even if I could. Everything that was so safe and known and comfortable and familiar to me, that had been snatched away. So instead, I looked for something that I could immerse myself in, something that wouldn't remind me of that day in November. And what I found was something I could never imagine myself doing. My dad has been a software developer for over 30 years, and he's always encouraged me to learn how to program. I never took him that seriously because part of it was that I never thought I would need to learn how to code. But on a much deeper level, I was afraid I wasn't going to be good at it. In other words, I was afraid I was going to fail at it. But here I was already feeling like a failure. What more did I have to lose? I decided that I was going to teach myself how to code. And I dove into programming. Initially, it was really, really hard. Every single tutorial that I would do or book that I would read was an uphill battle, a constant struggle to try to understand something that was structured so differently than anything I'd ever done before. But it was still better than reliving what happened to me that day. When I programmed, I didn't think about all the stuff I couldn't do. I just focused on trying to learn this new thing and get as good as I could at it. And I soon realized that there was just so much to learn, and I couldn't do it alone. I knew I needed some help. And it was at that point that I discovered the Flatiron School, a school in New York City that's focused just on helping people learn how to code. My time there was transformational. I went from having no programming experience to building fully functional web applications. I was creating again. I was making things, and I was making things that people could use to solve real-world problems. Learning to program was the first time that I stopped trying to be that person I was before my assault. Instead, I focused on who I could be afterwards. Programming brought me to the next iteration of who I would be. Today, I get to write code every single day. And I love what I do. In fact, code is what brought me to Baltimore. I work with an amazing group of designers and developers in Mount Vernon. And sometimes when people hear that I was a writer and teacher before being a developer, I get asked the same question again and again. How did you get into code? Honestly, my answers to them are impersonal and generic. And that's because the truth of why I learned to code is far more complicated. And it's hard to talk about. But I've realized that even though it's hard for me to talk about, it's an important story to share. And that's because sexual violence and assault are endemic. And I don't just mean on a street corner in Mumbai. The Center for Disease Control found that 1 in 5 American women experience some form of sexual assault in their lifetime. And the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network found that 68% of assaults go unreported to the police. From our small towns and college campuses, and to our seemingly safe homes, and even the most well-lit city streets, the reality is that this happens everywhere. And for so many women, girls, and men, it is very much an everyday story. There are a lot of articles and headlines out there that talk about assault, but what happens if you actually survive it? What happens if you actually fight back the man with the knife and you survive to tell the tale? Where do you go from there? I don't know that I necessarily have the answers to these questions, but what I do have is what I live through. And for me, assault equated loss. Loss of ability and confidence and identity. Programming is what helped me regain that identity. It replaced that sense of loss with a sense of self-worth. I realized that even though that thing happened to me in November, I was still here. I was here and I had value. I had something to give to the world. I was worth something despite all that. And coding actually brought me back to the very things I thought I lost in the first place. I started writing again. And now most of the stuff I write is a bit more technical, but I love it. And I'm going to be teaching again for the first time since leaving Mumbai. Next month, I'll be teaching an intro to programming class right here in Baltimore for women who have never coded in their lives before. So maybe I wasn't supposed to be here. Maybe I wasn't supposed to be telling, I was supposed to be telling different stories. Or perhaps this story was the one I was meant to tell all along. Thank you. Thank you.